not in Kansas anymore.
We're not in Kansas anymore.
Don't you cry no more.
If there is one phrase that embodies the testing stage of the 2020s, it is, there is no place like home.
There's no place like home.
This was quite literal, even in the very beginning of the decade. The intersection between depression and testing is quite possibly the lowest point of the cycle. No one wants to be here, and it makes one long for another world, somewhere over the rainbow.
Somewhere over the rainbow.
You might be wondering why I am referencing The Wizard of Oz, a film that's over 80 years old, in a video about the 2020s. Well, I'm convinced that this stages of grief cycle has repeated several times throughout history. I believe that the previous testing stage was the 1940s. I haven't quite developed a full theory for this previous cycle yet, but I believe that the last shock stage was the 1890s. Denial was the 1900s. Anger was the 1910s. Bargaining was the Roaring 20s. The Great Depression was the 1930s. And finally, testing was the 1940s. It is easy to see how the 1940s was a dark time, as it was World War II, and the events that took place in this decade created a new world order that has ruled ever since. The testing stage is a decisive moment where we will test new solutions with varying degrees of success. America won World War II and became the new global hegemon. I believe that this power has been in decline for some time now, and that whatever transpires in the 2020s will create a new superpower, a new victor that creates a new regime. So when I say that we aren't in Kansas anymore, I mean that literally as well. The American world that we were born into is one that we no longer live in. The Wizard of Oz was released in 1939, pretty much the 1940s, and I believe it is a testing-themed work of art. The old power structure is revealed. We see the man behind the curtain.
Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. The great Oz has spoken.
Who are you?
Oh, I am the great and powerful Wizard of Oz.
You are? I don't believe you.
We are no longer threatened by or believe in the propaganda of this regime. And this old order is defeated. Ding dong, the witch is dead.
Ding dong, the witch is dead. Ding dong, the wicked witch is dead.
Given that we are only in 2024, we still have more than half of this decade ahead of us, and the few years that we have already lived through are so brand new to us that there is no work of art that I could have picked that would have sufficed. So I thought I'd look back to the previous cycle and pick a work of testing art that everyone would be somewhat familiar with. However, the genre of fiction that I would associate with the 2020s is the multiverse. The testing stage is partly defined by being a sort of collage of all the past decades put together. As I wrote this, it hit me that even my own series is a work of testing media. If the Depression era was about self-reflection, testing is all about collective reflection, looking at all the achievements as well as all the flaws of our own culture up to this point. I recently played through a video game called Astrobot, and it's the first time I went into a video game while keeping this theory in mind as I was playing. It struck me how many references were in the game. Astrobot is a PlayStation game about PlayStation games. It is pretty meta. I got to see Crash Bandicoot, Spyro the Dragon, Cole McGrath from Infamous, Wander from Shadow of the Colossus, Joel and Ellie from The Last of Us, Sackboy from Little Big Planet, and the Maiden in Black from Demon Souls. The game itself is a celebration of gaming, a compilation of PlayStation itself. The ending of Astrobot also struck me as significant. After the final boss, Astrobot becomes disassembled and you have to reassemble him. You put his arms and legs back on. The testing phase is all about putting yourself back together after being worn down by the depression stage. Going back to the 1940s for a second, it kinda reminds me of Pinocchio becoming a real boy.
I'm a real boy!
You are a real boy!
If the 2010s depression phase was where we lost our humanity, the testing stage is where we regain it. Much like how the bargaining stage was in a way a second denial, the testing stage is akin to a second bargaining. Since you were unable to take the easy way out in the bargaining stage, you need a new way out. This time, it is the hard way out, the thing that you did not want to do. It should be noted that a lot of people don't really make it to this point individually. Most stay in denial, many remain in anger, some continue to bargain, and a few get lost in depression. Needless to say, most people on an individual level are not willing to do the difficult task that the testing stage puts forth. But I still think that the broader zeitgeist of the 2020s is the testing phase. You can feel it in the air, so to speak. And regardless of their individual disposition, these people still ultimately follow where the broader culture is going. I think that this is also part of the reason that testing stage art has an eclectic array of influences. The testing stage is the exact opposite of the denial era. The denial era of the 80s was a rather homogeneous culture. The testing stage is rather heterogeneous. It has a lot more contrasting ideas and competing factions. So the media of the 2020s is really all over the place and lacks identity. You even see this happening in music, where some people claim that music genres are dying and aren't really a thing anymore. This is because artists nowadays lack that grounded formula of past decades. They can't even defy convention because there has not been any standard convention for some time now. So they can't follow the structure, nor can they rebel against it, because that homogeneous culture no longer exists. What is rock and roll in the 2020s? I couldn't tell you. You can't have a standard rock band like AC/DC, and neither can you have a postmodern deconstruction of rock music like Nirvana.
One more special message to go, then I'm done, and I can go home.
There are no tropes to emulate nor subvert in rock music today. Everything's been said and done. So what you end up with is either forgettable homages to past decades, or musical artists that just play every music genre imaginable and have no core identifiable style because every song they do is different. Examples of this are 100 Gex, Kim Dracula,
But baby, would still choose.
and Poppy.
The best bang since the big one. Ooh, heavy. Keep telling yourself that you've been playing nice and go back for forgiveness from Jesus the Christ.
The testing era is paradoxically defined by its inability to be defined. That is why the multiverse is so fitting. It is a genre of fiction that allows one to explore multiple realities simultaneously. The strength of this is that it allows you to look beyond your own limited perspective. Society has a narrative that is imposed by the power structure, and the idea of the multiverse shows you other possible timelines, other potential worldviews. What if Japan had won World War II instead of America? You would have been subjected to a completely different narrative. We tend to believe that the narrative we've been told is the definitive truth, but it's ultimately just a story that we all agree upon. Or if you don't agree with it, it will be imposed on you, as this narrative is enforced. However, in the 2020s, it would seem the narrative has lost its power. The idea that America is the land of freedom and the pursuit of happiness is a myth that is becoming more and more difficult to maintain. Perhaps there will be some sort of event analogous to the fall of the Berlin Wall for America. The Soviet Union collapsed, and the current regime of the USA could similarly fall out of relevance. We are entering a new era. I won't pretend to know what will come next, but we are in a time where we will move from one world to another, just like how multiverses jump from one universe to another. This is why the testing stage is a positive charge decade, as it is proposing a new idea or even multiple options. The following stage, acceptance, is negative charged, as it will shoot down all these varied options and send us down a particular path. Only one of these worldviews will prevail, and we will have to accept the victor as the new ruling power. This is why, despite having a positive charge, testing may not be quite as fun as denial or even bargaining. There will be actual stakes this time around. Everything is turned upside down. The ones you thought were rebels are the ultimate conformists. The ones you thought were heroes turned out to be the most vile of villains. The ones you thought were crazy now seem like the most sane people. Your perception of reality is shattering. It is much akin to the breaking free from the Matrix theme of the 90s anger era. However, it's even beyond that. It's more like a matrix within the matrix. And to demonstrate the difference between anger and testing, I will contrast and compare The Matrix with one of the best works of fiction from the previous testing era, 1984 by George Orwell from 1949. In The Matrix, Neo joins a resistance, and they win in the end. In 1984, Winston joins a resistance, and it turns out that the resistance itself is a fabrication designed by the very people that they were rebelling against, and Winston is completely defeated as a result. This is what I mean by Matrix within the Matrix. You cannot roleplay the rebel or the hero in the testing stage. You will just be a useful idiot for the regime. In the testing stage, you will be tested. If you are a true rebel or a genuine hero, that will be put to the test. However, it will likely feel less like you are Hercules proving his endurance, and more like you are a lab rat being experimented on. You are the guinea pig, and much like Winston from 1984, you will not be the same after this testing has concluded. The testing stage is where one is the most vulnerable. You are completely at the mercy of the world. I mentioned before that bargaining stage art is taboo. Well, if that's the case, then testing stage art is almost heretical. Testing art often reveals such naked vulnerability and weakness. By contrast, the 80s denial art evoked a hyper-masculine image. People are drawn to the strength of Rambo or a Man of War album cover. Then the 2000s bargaining era had a very androgynous quality to it, embracing both the masculine as well as the feminine. Finally, the 2020s testing era has a hyper-feminine energy to it. It's almost as if our entire culture has transitioned from male to female, and I can already hear many lamenting this change. The West has fallen, they say. We need masculinity once again. But I argue, if there is going to be a rebirth of culture, it will be through the feminine. Woman gives birth, both literally and symbolically. It is only through her that a renaissance is possible. Sometimes femininity is a feature, not a bug. So, once we reach the end of this humiliation ritual, once we endure this test, we will reach acceptance. Acceptance may be bittersweet, but at least there will be closure. I suppose I should address the missing link. If the last acceptance stage was the 1950s and the shock stage was the 1970s, where does that place the 1960s? I believe the 60s is what I call the peace stage. Beyond acceptance, peace isn't just accepting the loss, but making peace with it. Peace is perhaps the healthiest stage to be at. Then, of course, the rug is pulled out from underneath, inducing shock once again. So, if the 2020s is testing, the 2030s is acceptance, 2040s is peace, and then the 2050s will be the next shock stage, and we will start all over. So to end this series on a positive note, we seem to have the decades of acceptance and peace ahead of us. It's all uphill from here. It's a steep incline and difficult to climb, but things are at least looking up. Maybe we can't win.
A fight will never win, and time again we try.
We may never stop grieving, but we can find fulfillment in the process of life regardless. Our acculturation continues.